It's raining again. To be honest, I'm terrified of rain. I never leave the house when it's raining outside. But to give myself some credit, I never used to be like this. I used to love to watch the rain fall from the windows. But now, I always draw my curtains tight, over the edges of the windowsill. I wish I could show you what made me the way I am. Partly to warn you, partly to test myself. But I can't. I can only tell you my story, like it's some kind of fantasy, like it's just another bizarre story that deserves to be forgotten for a week. If that's how you see it, that's fine. But I won't forget. I'll never forget. In 2012, I was a 21-year-old student. I was madly in love with nature and all things wild. I spent my childhood wandering up and down tree lines, fantasizing about mythical creatures and fantastical monsters. So here I was in 2012 as an adult, studying forestry, with dreams of defending those tree lines, and fantasies I held so dear. I was absolutely ecstatic. He suggested that we spend a few days of our upcoming bray, on some of the trails and paths, to remember why we were doing what we were doing. As a keen walker, I knew of a trail a couple of hours from our town that offered plenty of space to walk, with very little crowding. The only people who really walked more than a few minutes down the trail were the park rangers, and the chances of meeting one of them on the widening paths of the forest seemed slim. "Hey Lily, want to go on a trip to the reserve with me?" I asked, as the bell finished ringing, signaling the end of the school day. The girl next to me, Lily, was a quiet and sweet girl. She had long brunette hair that went just past her shoulders, and gentle green eyes. She was the type of person that people admired from afar. Beautiful but quiet. An offhand joke or compliment would make her smile, but she would rarely say anything back. For most, that meant moving on to the next person. This made me want to be closer to her. We'd been friends for a while by then, whether or not had any sort of romantic intentions between us. Couldn't say. We just knew that we connected on a certain level. "Yeah, of course. Just tell me when." She looked into my eyes with a gentle smile on her face. I smiled back at her. I hoped this trip would end well. A few days passed. Lily and I spent our free time in the shops, gathering food and tents together. Soon we were all packed and ready to go. We took my little car with our bags tied to the roof and took the motorway a couple of hours east. By the time we got there, it was mid-afternoon. Plenty of time to walk, but also a bad time to find parking. There were lots of people here walking their dogs, setting up lunches and walking the paths. "I thought you said it was going to be quiet?" Lily asked with a slight chuckle. I rolled my eyes. "I'm sure these kids aren't planning on hiking." A few days in, "It will be quiet, I promise." I turned around and started to take our large from the roof of the vehicle. As big as they were surprisingly easy to carry. Lily slipped the straps over her shoulders and waited for me to start walking towards the park. As we approached the entrance to the trail, we saw a ranger standing guard. "Are you going in?" he asked. There was no hostility or caution in his tone. He was just asking a simple question. "Yes, that's all right," I said, questioning the fit middle-aged man. "Of course, just let me know your names and take my card. If you need anything, call the station. There's a couple of ranger huts down there. Feel free to use them if you need to. Just make sure you clean up." The ranger gave me a welcoming smile and handed me a card for the local ranger station. "Thank you. My name is Max. This is Lily." Lily gave a small nod to the ranger, and he nodded back respectfully. "Well, Max and Lily, enjoy yourselves out there. We'll be patrolling the area. So if you see us, don't be afraid to say hello." With those words, the ranger retreated from the entrance, and we began our tray. We spent half of the first day walking slowly in silent appreciation. There's something so freeing about walking without a time limit. It's like the whole world. Stress slips right off your back, and the only thing you have to worry about is yourself. At this very moment, you are all that. No bills, no studies, no worries. Just avoid snakes and weird plants and you're good to go. It wasn't long into our journey before the sun began to nestle behind the trees, and the warm but steadily dropping temperature of the late afternoon winds began to sweep under our sweaty clothes. "Let's find a clearing and settle down," Lily said, tilting her head from side to side, looking for a place to set up. I nodded in agreement and saw a small opening further down the path, clearly made by others on a similar journey. It only took a few minutes to set up our tents in the clearing and light a small fire. After all the walking and hard work, we were finally ready to be off our feet for a while. Lily sat down on the side of the fire where I was sitting and pulled out a muesli bar to eat. I felt a rumbling in my stomach and pulled out one of my own. "This place is really nice," she said. I took a big bite out of the bar. "Yes, but I haven't seen many animals yet." I unwrapped my food and put it to my lips, ready to take a bite. I glanced over at Lily and froze. In the darkening forest, just off the path, just behind Lily, was something about the size of half a football. It was shrouded in darkness, but I assumed it must have been some sort of small animal. I started to squint my eyes, trying to focus on it, but whatever it was seemed to vanish out of existence, straight into the ground. "Are you all right?" Lily asked. I realized it must have looked like I was staring at her with food, half in my mouth. I laughed and shrugged, shaking my head gently. "Yes, sorry. I thought I saw an animal or something off in the woods. It was small, could have been just a rabbit or something. It must have burrowed into the ground though." My friend looked over her shoulder, into the silent woods, and looked around. I knew she wouldn't see anything. Whatever it was gone as soon as I saw it. We finished our meal, put out the fire, and climbed into our separate tents. I slept like a log. All that walking had put me out like a light. It wasn't until the morning that I woke up. I stumbled out of the tent, almost tripping over the small cloth. At the exit of my portable shelter, the hot and humid summer morning sun hit me like a ton of bricks. "Just so you know, I think we should watch out for snakes," Lily said quietly as I wiped my brow. I looked over at her. To see her, I was pulling the taut poles from the forest floor. "Have you seen one?" I asked. She bent down and followed with a camp cleaner. "I think so. I heard something rubbing on the floor of my tent last night." I opened my eyes, and the indentations on my walls looked like a pretty, thick snake trying to wriggle its way in. It didn't seem bothered by the potential late-night visitor, so I kept her warning in mind, but moved on. As our journey continued, we realized that with every step we took, there was another block in the sky. Somehow a storm was brewing above us, that none of the forecasts we'd seen had warned us. "How long before it rains?" Lily was interrupted by a huge thunderclap in the clouds nearby. I felt the earth shake beneath us before a few drops of rain began to fall from the dimly lit sky. "Thank you, Lily," I said. I bowed my head in her direction. She scoffed and I laughed. The rain was little more than a drizzle at this point, but it was clear it was going to get worse. "Let's hurry and find a place to set up." I watched as she began to pick up her pace, slowly moving from a walk to a jog. She was heading further down the path. I followed right beside her. For a while, it looked like we weren't going to find a clearing anytime soon. We were already on the verge of being undoubtedly soaked. And to our luck, at that very moment, another powerful thunderclap erupted from above. This time, the floodgates were opened. The rain began to fall with purpose, and with enough force to erupt on impact. Splash! Anything nearby was drenched with the watery contents of the drop. "Hey, over there!" I heard Lily call out, barely audible through the thunderous rain. She was running off the main path, down a small side path nearby. I looked where she was going and saw a small hut. I ran off the path with her. With each step, more and more mud was pushing up against my legs. I increased my speed. I hoped to catch up with my fleet-footed friend, but something caught me off guard. The tip of my foot slipped underneath something, and my momentum carried me downwards, face first into a bath of MUD. I was dazed for a few seconds. I just lay there in the running mud pit. Eventually, I looked down at my feet and saw what looked like a thin tree root, also covered in mud, sticking out of the ground. But as my eyes continued along the track, these initial assumptions fell by the wayside. The shimmer of the mud made me realize that whatever this object was, it was moving just below the MUD. Then it clicked in my head. The snakes Lily had mentioned. I had just stumbled over one of them. I felt a shiver run down my back, and I jerked back to my feet and continued on my way, leaving the snake behind. Without further incident, I made it to the cabin doors and burst inside, finally free from the hurricane-like storm. Wow, a familiar voice rang out from inside the hut. I glanced over to see her drenched, but otherwise clean Lily, staring at me with an amused smile on her face. We decided to have a wrestling match outside. Haha, funny, I said, looking down at myself. Mud was dripping from just about every pore of my body. I think I met one of your snakes, she mentioned out there. It decided to give me a little trip. Oh really, Lily said, as she grabbed me and turned me around. I searched the pack on my back for something to help me clean up. You were right, they're quite thick. I wonder what kind they are. I can't imagine they're poisonous. They're so wide. I felt my companion's hands, pulling out cloth from my rucksack. I took a moment to look around the hut as Lily pulled the towels off. It was wooden, old and completely empty. There was a cooker off to one side, but other than that, it looked very bare. Clearly, it was just meant for a quick night's sleep. Here, get yourself cleaned up. I turned back around. Lily handed me a bundle of towels. I immediately wiped my face and forehead. The dirt was already starting to dry and stuck to my skin. Thank you, I replied to her as she started to put her things away. I put my rucksack down by the door and walked over to a window. I was still wiping myself. I watched as the rain continued its assault on the earth, the dirt running like down the valleys and paths, both natural and man-made. It looks terrible outside. I noticed. I heard a small from behind me. I let my eyes wander across the forested wetland, over to the path we took to get here. My body tightened when I saw something right where I had stumbled. Something was sticking out of the ground, like a small pillar. I rubbed the inside of the window in vain to clear the fog and the obstructing rain. I could barely make out what looked like a thick, partially submerged branch, broken off at one end, with small branches splintering off towards the sky. Hey, come and have a look, I called to Lily, who was still fiddling with her bags. Is it the snake? She asked. She rose to her feet. I don't think so. It looks weird though. I watched the mud-covered object being pounded by the rain. As Lily approached and looked outside, is that a broken tree root? She suggested. I could only shrug. Whatever it was, it wasn't moving. Wait, Lily chipped in again. Look at the color. As more and more of the rain ran down the object, the less the object was obstructed by the MUD. I narrowed my eyes, past the raindrops on the window, and saw exactly what Lily was talking about. Whatever was under the mud was a pale shade of gray. Oh my God! Lily gasped and covered her mouth. I turned and looked at her, my eyebrow arched in confusion. Look at the end of it, she said, holding her breath. I turned my gaze back outwards and concentrated. I felt my heart drop. Fingertips. It was an arm reaching out from the ground, silent as the grave. Oh my God! My voice wavered slightly. We should call the rangers and get her out of here. Where's your map? She asked, and reached towards me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a wet but legible business card. Without hesitation, Lily snatched it from my hand and started to dial the number. Hello, I'd like to report something on one of the trails. She paced back and forth on the squeaky cabin floor. I turned to look at the hand. It looks frozen in place, fingers eagerly reaching for the sky. I let the water rush over it, "We're here," it began to stutter. "We're here." I heard the voice on the other end of the phone. Lily nodded. "Hey, Max, can you step outside and tell me what the numbers are?" "Next to the door." I looked away from the hand. I felt an increasingly oppressive air, pushing its way into the cabin. I shook off my intuition and walked to the door. I opened it and stepped outside. I looked towards the arm and could see it more clearly, without the blurred window between us. It was hairless, smooth, and the fingernails looked clean and trimmed. The water splashing over it almost seemed to disappear on impact, as if it were some kind of sponge. I had to force my eyes away from her to look at the number on the wall. 17. I took a deep breath and repeated the number in my head, before the sound of a loud clap echoed behind me. I jumped slightly. I turned back in the direction of the arm and saw nothing in its place, just the mud running quickly down the path. I swallowed hard and hurried back inside. The number 17, but I think the arm fell back into the MUD, is no longer there. Lily's eyes went wide as she relayed this information to the dispatcher. It wasn't too long before she pulled the phone out of her ear and hung up. They told us to stay put and that this storm was not going to pass anytime soon. They said they had a ranger on the way and the police were informed, but it might take them a while to reach us out here. I bit my lip and looked back out at the empty path. I hoped the current didn't take it away. I muttered. Lily came up beside me and joined me at the window. "I'm sure they'll be able to follow this MUD to wherever it goes. At least the rain has cleaned you up a bit." She gave me a reassuring smile, and I looked down at myself. My clothes were still covered in MUD, but the rain on my skin seemed to have washed it away, most of the dirt. "I guess that's always a plus," I said stoically. "Come on, Max, let's at least make ourselves at home. I'll just lock the door in case, you know?" A voice trailed off. "In case there's a killer out there?" I muttered to her. She walked over to the door and turned the lock. She turned and averted her eyes from mine, choosing instead to continue her mission of getting ready. After a few minutes of silence, we had our food laid out in front of us. We agreed that as soon as the ranger arrived, our little expedition would be over. We'd seen more than enough in the last 2 days than we could see in a lifetime. "Let's eat and try to get some sleep," I said, charging up some extra rations. Lily nodded and joined in the feast. With full stomachs, we got ready for bed. I noticed my friend kept looking out the darkened windows. I could feel the tension in the air. "Are you all right?" I asked. Lily shook her head dismissively. "I just feel weird, like I'm being watched. I'm sure it's nothing, but just to be on the safe side." She tore off her pillowcase and then mine, before walking over to the windows and draped them over the glass as makeshift curtains. "I just don't want looking in at us while we sleep." "I don't blame you." I made my way to my bedroll and caseless pillow before lying down and tried to get comfortable. Lily did the same. It was a few hours into the night before I heard Lily's soft voice. Max, wake up. Do you hear that?" I opened my eyes, less groggy than I had expected, and met Lily's gaze. She was staring at the wooden door of the cabin. I watched the door for a few seconds before I saw the handle jiggle slightly. Someone was trying to get in. "What are we going to do?" Lily asked, speechless. "Maybe he's in there?" Our whispered conversation was interrupted by a loud knocking from the other side of the wooden door. I jumped to my feet. It must be the cops. I began my slow, meticulous walk to the door. "Who's out there?" Silence. "Hello," I shouted again. Suddenly the banging started again, loud enough to drown out my voice. I stepped back from the door and knelt close to the floor. Each impact on the door shook the wooden frame of the small cabin. I watched as one of the cushioned curtains slowly began to slide from the window. "No," Lily whispered, with tears in her eyes. I rushed to the window as the fabric fell and came face to face with the darkness outside. The banging on the door suddenly stopped. I kneeled down very carefully and took the cloth in my hands to throw it back over the window. A thud emerging from the darkness, was the palm of a hand, striking the window with great force. I could only see the pale palm, in the shroud of blackness outside. I quickly threw the pillowcase back at the window and walked back to Lily. She was trembling. Her eyes were wide with fear. That was the hand, Max. That was the hand that was outside earlier. I felt my heart sink into my stomach. I put my arms around Lily, for my comfort as well as hers. The wet palm kept slapping the glass. I could hear ripples of cracks spreading along the pane. I held on to Lily as she cried out, and kept my eyes on the pillowcase covering the glass, hoping it wouldn't fall off, exposing the lifeless arm again. With a final thud, it stopped. A light shone through the fabric of the window. Only seconds after the attack had stopped, I could hear the sound of wheels rolling towards the cabin. I let out a sign, a prayer, that the Rangers had finally made it, with the sound of the wheels stopping just a few meters away. Yards away, I finally heard a voice calling out from the void outside. "Lily, Max, you in there?" The voice sounded familiar. It was the Ranger from the day before. I scrambled to my feet, dragging Lily with me. "Yes, we're inside, but there's someone out there," I shouted. I ran to the door and opened it to see the Rangers standing stiffly in the middle of the small opening in front of the cabin. He was facing us, but the light from his rover combined with his hat covered his body in intense shadows. His body seemed rigid. "Come out of that box and we'll take you home," said the Ranger. His voice seemed different this time, disconnected from his body. I remained silent. Something was very wrong here. "Come out of there now," the voice grumbled, unrecognizable from before. "Are you all right?" I called out, a little more than a whisper. "Of course I am. Can't you see my smile?" The Ranger tilted his neck back. His hat slipped from his head, allowing the light from behind him to illuminate his face. His eyes were wide and filled with pain and fear. His lips quivered in shock. I backed away from the doorway and watched as two impossibly long fingers came out from behind the Ranger's head and worked their way down his cheeks to his mouth. They slid in with little resistance and began to pull his lips out in a mocking, cruel smile. Then they continued to pry. I watched as his lips tightened with the force of the fingers inside his mouth. His lips turned white with the strain placed against them, before a shower of red erupted from his mouth, splitting the centers of his lips like sliced meat. "I am so perfectly happy," cried a voice from just behind the Ranger. His voice was thick and unnatural. I looked for the sauce and froze. There, right next to the Ranger's feet, was a half-submerged human face, buried deep in the MUD. His black, cold eyes were glowing from some unknown sauce. Whatever it was a monster of the strictest definition. Its gaze was so far removed from humanity that there was nothing in common between us. When I made eye contact with this thing, human in form and fiendish in its eyes, I saw the Ranger fall into the MUD. Just behind his head was a long spidery arm, reaching out from the ground. It seemed to change size and shape, as if it were only dimly obeying the laws of this reality. The Ranger's body twitched and convulsed on the ground, as more and more lifeless hands began to out of the mud and wrapped their hands around his body. I was so thirsty, but now I'm so hungry. The submerged head cooled unblinkingly towards me, without another warning. The Ranger's body was torn from the ground and swallowed by the MUD. The ground where he lay shifted and bubbled, like a small eruption. The creature's eyes stared at me with a deadly gaze. It was watching me. I let out a small chirp, without changing my expression. The head effortlessly began to glide through the earth towards the cabin. Fingers and arms popped out of the earth around it, like the fins of a shark. I had enough courage to slam the door shut and lock it, before running back to Lily, who had seen the whole thing. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking. I shook my head and collapsed beside her. "I don't know." We sat in silence. until the sound of scratching came from under the floorboards, hundreds of fingers tearing flesh down to the bone, trying to claw their way up. All we could do was to sit in the corner furthest from the windows and pray they didn't get us. That night, we watched the floors pulsate up and down. As the foundation started to crumble, those arms were going to drag us and our wooden coffin down into the earth. Down into the earth. I didn't know what to do. I sat there as the ground cracked open, and mud crawled up through the seams of the boards, like blood flowing from a vein. I sat there waiting to die, but Lily had other plans. She grabbed my hand and pulled me to my feet. She stared at the door for a split second, before sprinting off with me in tow. She burst through the door and ran towards the ranger's vehicle. Lucky for us, the ranger never shut it off before the earth took him down. We both jumped into his seat and sped off back the way we came. I glanced back at the cabin to see it crumble into the ground, but there was something else, still half submerged in the path. Just a few feet from us was this unblinking head. Its black eyes shone dead and emotionless. On our flight, we drove and drove for God knows how long, until we came upon some other rangers. We were on a reconnaissance mission, up to us and then our missing comrade. We told them all we could, but the looks of disbelief told us enough. We were labeled as emotionally disturbed and unreliable witnesses. The powers that be described the disappearance of the ranger in the hut as an accident caused by a mudslide. Now every time it rains, I wonder if somewhere in the forest is a single head peering out at the trails, waiting for someone to pass by, a million hands waiting just below the surface to pull it down into the earth.